In today's tutorial, we are going to be breaking down the Dodford style of animation. Before we hop into actually breaking it down, I think it's worth talking a little bit about what it is and why it works so well, so that we can understand the thinking behind the techniques. His content mainly relies on B-roll, images, articles, a lot of narration. So it's very important to have some really smooth stuff that goes with it, but also keep it fairly fast paced because the videos are longer. So in order to keep the viewer engaged, you need to spice it up with some quick cuts and a lot of information that gets thrown at you. And he uses a lot of depth of field and blur and a little bit of texture to spice it up a little bit. And all of those techniques helps create a more mysterious universe, which is what he's trying to uncover in those videos. A little bit of a photo showcase, some article animation, and also the type of textures you could play on to create a kind of a more mysterious and intriguing look. But without further ado, let's hop straight into After Effects, where I have a 1920 by 1080 composition set up. 24 frames per second, keep it nice and easy. I've already created a little bit of a folder structure here just to make it nice and easy on us. We've got the assets, we've got some articles, some photos, and some textures, but we're gonna keep it super simple for today. I wanna start out with the article animation, and here we're gonna do a little bit of an article match cut. That's one technique he uses quite often, is centering in on the name of a person in a bunch of different articles and cutting between them. Essentially, it's a super simple match cut animation, but it works super well and we can spice it up just a little bit. So if I drag in all of these articles that I have right here, and I just drag them in, and I am gonna pre-comp them and name this article mashup pre, and drag that into the pre-comps folder right there, and then open that up so we can work with it. And I'm just gonna hide every single one except for the first one. I am gonna scale it up to fit. So we're gonna kind of be taking all the articles, they all have the word anniversary in them, and then we're gonna be creating a match cut sequence through that. What I'm actually gonna do is go about half a second forward, so 12 frames, and I'm gonna split it by hitting Shift Command D and take all the other layers and chop them up to that, because we're gonna start with a little bit more of a zoomed out view of the article. So if I scale it down a little bit just to barely fit, maybe go something like right there. And then from there, we can get a more zoomed in version. And that's just gonna create a little bit of initial intrigue into what we're seeing and a little bit of context as well. And then you can hit Option and apostrophe to bring up your grid. And that's what we'll be using to center all the articles. So I'm gonna take it, hit S to bring up scale, and then I'm gonna zoom in a good bunch. And I'm gonna place it right around the middle. And you just kind of wanna scale this to kind of fit so we don't have any edges showing, and also having this right in the middle pretty roughly just like that. And then let's go half a second forward and trim all of that, and then show the next layer. And again, we will be finding where it says anniversary, and then we will be focusing in on that. So in this case, we have it very big, but instead we can take this little one, which will make maybe just a little bit more sense, and scale it up and have that come in right there in the middle. And now if we go back, we can see we have anniversary and anniversary, the same focal points, which is just gonna help draw your attention into that specific point, so you know, your eyes already know where to look, and that just makes it a little bit easier to digest when you use a lot of quick cuts. And again, half a second forward, take all these articles and drag them up, and then show the next one. And again, S to bring up the scale and scale it up. And the good thing about working with PDFs like I am in this case is that we can scale them up a whole bunch. Always continuously rasterize these to keep the quality intact. So as you can see, it just helps a lot in keeping the quality and actually making that text readable at such large scales. So let's find where it says anniversary in this one. And it does right there, so maybe just scale that one down a little bit, move it upwards. That looks pretty good. So now we have boom, 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 another half a second. Drag these up and show the next one. Scale it up and find what it says anniversary. This one might be a little bit too big for what we are trying to do, so we might just delete this one, just because if it's too different, might look a little bit funky. So we want to keep a roughly the same scale. Scale that up, and last but not least, this last one. Again, this one might be a little bit too big also, so we can delete that. And now if we play this back, we have this, and then just kind of focuses in. But it's still a little bit confusing because we don't quite know what it is we're looking at. And that's where the highlighter effect comes in. Let's start with this first bit of article, because I actually want to scale it up just a little bit. And we're just going to add the tiniest bit of movement to it, just to help give it just a little bit more of feeling, if you could call it that. And then we'll just give it a slight rotation animation, and we will keyframe the rotation and also the position, and then we will move it forward just a little bit, and then maybe give it like a 1 or 2, -2 works pretty good, and then just move it up and a little bit to the right, just like that. And then we'll take these keyframes and just drag them off a little bit so that the movement keeps flowing a little bit off as well, so we don't get like a stop right there. And those will take one to the left, and then if we play that back, we just get a little tiny bit of movement. Might even drag these out a little bit more just so we get some real subtle. We will hide our little grid and then hit G to bring up your pen tool, and then we will add a stroke, and let's just make this yellow, just a typical, nothing too crazy, and then remove the fill because we won't be needing that at all. And then we can highlight this, so click and just click again to create a stroke, and then you can increase the width of that stroke and then set it to multiply to show the text underneath. And you can always go in and change the color if you want something different. Maybe you want like a pink or a red color, completely up to you. This works pretty good. And then we will open this up and add a trim paths animation. So add a trim paths and then go into trim paths and keyframe the end and just move it forward a little bit. And then right at the beginning of the clip, set it to 0. So we have that. So as soon as that comes in, we have this little text that highlights it. If the text is the same size when you have it all zoomed in, it makes it a little bit easier to follow along. So right here, we will just cut it and hit U to remove the keyframes for the trim paths because we don't need that. And then we can open this back up and go into shape and go into path, click the path, and then shift click either one of these. And then you can drag it in to move these points and then increase the width of the stroke if need be. And we will do this for each one of these to match up where they need to be exactly, just like that. And if I hit U, it'll collapse everything. And now playing that back, we have this nice little animation, and the yellow really helps draw our attention to what we need. And then of course you see there's a little bit of color difference or contrast difference. So this one is very bright while this one isn't. And we can go in and add a levels effect to each of the articles and play around with this. So drag up the contrast, drag that in a little bit to kind of match the contrast and brightness of all the different scenes. Paste that in there. Drag this up just a little bit more and paste that on there. So now we have something that just looks a little bit more similar in terms of like that style. But that is pretty much it for the animation itself, and you can always adjust the timing between. You don't have to do half a second because that might even be a little bit long. You can speed it up a little bit. 6 frames works wonderfully as well. We'll be adding more to it later, but it kind of goes in hand with the photo sequence as well. Now we can add our photos. So if you go back into this, I have my photos already in here. And then of course, very typical Dodford style to have a little TV in there as like an introductionary thing. And we'll hide the article mashup thing. And then we will start with the TV and we'll scale that down a little bit to fit in our scene. And we can even pre-comp all of these and name this photo scene pre and drag that into our presets or pre-comp folder. Open that up. So we have this TV here and we want to start with a very simple position scale animation. Let's scale it down a little bit and then add a position and scale keyframe to this and just let's do half a second, just the slightest bit of zoom and maybe down a little bit so that we still get a little bit of those legs. And now we just have that very subtle zoom in. Space these out a little bit more so it's not too intense. Let's move that back. And then we are going to double click on the TV layer and then we can add a mask to this. So if we go hit G to create a little mask, we can follow along this path and just roughly clicking and dragging, creating something that kind of works just a little bit like that. We can always clean that up and let's adjust these curves just a little bit as such. Boom. And then if we click on the layer and hit M, we can then invert the mask. So now we have nothing but the TV. If you go back into this, you can see we now revealed the other image. You can duplicate that and then hit M and then unselect the invert or like uninvert it. And then you can drag that below the TV itself. And then if you hold shift while hitting plus or minus, you can cycle through the blend modes. And that way you can still get some of the lighting effects from the TV. Like this, for example, linear light. Just looks pretty cool having some of that in there. You know, it's a nice little detail to add. Then we can cut right about, let's do 12 frames. We will cut that off and go into our actual scene, which is that right there. I want to do a little cut between these. So we have a detailed shot and then we have a more wider shot as well, just to give it a little bit of context. So maybe have this one right there, put them off to the side a little bit just to create a little bit more of that interesting vibe. Drag that below because I want this other one to come in first. Scale that down to fit pretty well. Maybe move it just like that. So we have these two coming in. Bada bing, bada boom. Right here, trim that so we only have this little bit. And we will scale that down to fit inside the TV. And again, play around with the TV overlay screen. You can even decrease the opacity a little bit to make it look a little bit nicer. And you can take this little cutout, let's drag it right there. And then if you take the parenting and link it to the TV layer, now it scales with it. So just, you know, make sure that it actually looks like we're zooming in on something and not just scaling one layer and another layer. I want to add a little bit of a match cut between this one and our second scene, so it kind of zooms in a little bit, and it's going to be pretty simple to do. We can just hit S to bring up the scale and Shift P to bring up the position, keyframe both of those, go forward a little bit, and then scale it up and then move it so that we still have him in kind of roughly the same spot as this one ends. So as you can see, we have the grid line right here, which is where his face is, and then we just want to make sure that we scale it up a little bit and keep that guy in that same frame so that it zooms into him and into the other person that is in our next scene. And then we can just space out these keyframes a little bit, go forward, hit S and Shift P again on this bottom one, keyframe both of that, and then we can just scale it out a little bit and move him up, scale it down a little bit more even, move it up like that, kind of keep him in that same position and line up the keyframes with each other. And then you can use sexy speed like I will in this case, which is just a very simple curve, just dragging them in and creating some center speed, slow in, pick up speed and slow out. And now if we play that back, we get just a tiny bit of a match cut, and that might even be a little bit too much too far, so we can space them out a little bit more, center up the keyframes between these two layers so we just have something that looks kind of like, and we might even add just a tiny bit of scale animation to this just so it slowly looks like it's zooming in. And it's super simple to do so. You just want to add a transform effect to this, and then in the transform effect you can keyframe the scale, hit U to show that keyframe, and then maybe just zoom in a little bit, just scale it up ever so slightly just like that, and just drag that outside the layer and that one before it, and just keep it linear just so we get a little bit of that movement in there. And that is pretty much it for the little photo sequence, but we are far from done because most of the magic is done in the texturing and the little extra effects that he adds in there. So if you go back into our main sequence, let's say we have this first one comes in, zooms into that, and then let's cut that into our little match cut sequence right there. And let's just increase the length of our main sequence and hit OK. We can show that, and then we'll just trim it down a little bit. That was definitely way too long. And then right click, trim comp to work area. So now we have something that looks kind of like this if we put all of them together. Just a nice little, very simple so far sequence. Next thing we're gonna do is add an adjustment layer in here, and we will add a levels to this one, and we will just increase the brightness of just ever so slightly. You don't want to overdo it. You just want to have a slight increase in the brightness and maybe even up the contrast a little bit, just so we get a little bit of a brighter image. So now if you hide that, you can see we just get a little bit more light in there. And then we're going to hit T on that adjustment layer, and we are going to alt click the opacity to add an expression to it. And we will set the posterize to something like, let's start with 12. And then we will add a wiggle expression, 10,10, and see what that looks like. Still just a little bit too subtle. And what we're trying to do is just get a very subtle flicker of light. You'll barely notice it, but it just makes it feel a little bit more like, almost like a horror movie where you have a light flickering in the corner, which is exactly the type of look that we're gonna go for in this, because it is mysterious. It is kind of like, ooh, intriguing. And we can add another adjustment layer to this, and this time we will add a transform, and we will set the scale to 101. So we don't have any edges bleeding, and then we will alt click the position this time, and then add a posterize time, and then set that to 12, and then a wiggle expression. Let's do 15,3, and hit U to hide all of that. And you can of course go in and rename your adjustment layers. That's a really good idea. I would highly recommend doing that. So let's just name this flicker, and our second one camera shake. So now we just have a tiny little bit more of movement, and that might even be too much to have that 15,3. Decrease that ever so slightly. Let's do 2, and then increase maybe this to my personal favorite, 222. Just a little bit more of a subtle look in my opinion. That looks pretty neat. And this little sequence here, if we open that up, I actually want to add motion blur to all our layers here, just to give us a little bit more feel in there. Just helps it a little bit. And then a slight scale animation on this guy as well. And then we can just copy this transform and paste it onto this, and hit U to show the keyframes, and then just drag them out a little bit, and that'll just give us a tiny bit more movement. And might even want to drag the anchor point out a little bit so that it doesn't look as weird. Just like that, we have the basics of our little scene, a little bit of light flickering, just creating a little bit of that mystique. Next up, let's add a little bit of stylization to this. I like the look of this first one, but I do want to change the image itself to a black and white. That's very easy. Just add a hue saturation and just drag the saturation all the way down, and you can copy that and paste it onto the other layers as well. And then you might even want to add a little bit of a curves, so you can play around with the contrast a little bit, and then copy that and paste it onto the other images and play around until you get something you think looks pretty good. And for this one in particular, this little photo scene, I actually want to duplicate my TV, and if I solo it out so we can kind of see what we're doing, I'll add a hue and saturation and decrease the saturation all the way, and then I'll add an extract effect, and that just allows me to take out either the blacks or the whites. So if I drag out the blacks here, you can see it takes out the blacks, and turning transparency on, it makes it transparent. And you can use this to feather it out a little bit, and then select it, and I just want the brightest of brights. And you can even add a curves above of your extract effect, and then take out the blacks a little bit and increase the brights just ever so slightly. So we have something that kind of looks like that, and maybe even push it just a little bit more as such. And then I will add a deep glow to it, and that'll just help spice it up a little bit. And I will move this mask around so that we don't get so much of this floor over here, but mainly just the other bits and pieces, just like that. And now if I unhide that, you can see we just get the tiniest bit of glow that just adds a little bit more character in there. And in the deep glow, they have a super nice effect, which is the chromatic aberration. You can enable that, which will just add it to the glow elements. And then if you crank that up, you can kind of see it a little bit here. Change it to a red and green. That seems to be the most typical of what he uses, and we'll just scale it down ever so slightly. Just want it to be very faint. And again, if we go into the exposure of the deep glow and alt click it, we can add a posterized time, and let's set that to 12, and then we'll add another wiggle expression. Let's put that to something like 0.5, just so it's not too intense, and maybe even increase this to something like 15, just to get it to flicker just a tiny bit more. Barely noticeable in the grand scheme of things, but it just adds a little bit. Now we can go back into our main sequence, and if we play that back, we just have something that looks pretty simple, nothing too crazy. Next up is adding a little bit of a vignette. So again, add an adjustment layer and then add a vignette. Super simple, nothing too crazy, and then just increase the amount just a little bit to focus it in on that, and just create a little bit more focus towards the center of it, which is usually where most of it happens. Then we can go and of course rename this to vignette so we know what it is. And then below the camera shake, I'm actually going to add an adjustment layer, and this one is a paid plugin. There are a couple ways of doing this for free, but this one just makes it a lot easier, and that is Warp Chroma. And here we're just going to drag this first one down and then the second one down a little bit, and as you can see, it just kind of distorts it from the center and out, and just gives it a little bit of that chromatic aberration, and that just gives it a little bit more spice, I suppose. But this next one is one of my favorites, and to blur the edges just a little bit more, we will add first we will create a solid, and we will just name this blur map, and then hit OK. And then we can create a mask. So if I select my ellipse tool up here and just double click with the layer selected, it'll create a mask, and that's how we used to create vignettes in the old days. And then if we go to subtract and then go to feather, and just increase that a whole bunch, and then we can add a composite to this. So we will do a solid composite, and make sure that it's white so that it's just black and white values. And then we can hide this layer completely, and then underneath the flicker we'll add an adjustment layer, and then add a camera lens blur, and then we will set the shape to hexagon. That's completely fine. You can also do higher if you want a more pleasing look. In the blur map, we will select our blur map and then do effects and masks. And if you crank up the blur radius a little bit, you can see that it now blurs the middle. So it takes the white values and blurs it, but you can simply invert it. So it makes it a little bit easier for us. And then if you crank that up, you can see it blurs only the edges of it. This mask, and move it around, you can see how it's affecting that. And that helps, especially in the articles, just make it a little bit easier to see what it is all this says. And you can always play with the feathering if you feel like it's a bit too harsh. But we also have another layer of this, and that is to create a little bit of a blob shape. If you pay close attention to clips like this, you can see there's a little bit of blur moving across the screen very slowly. You might think it's just depth of field, but it looks to me more like it's a shape layer that he's added turbulent displace to and animated around a little bit. I don't know, it just kind of works. But we are gonna take our ellipse tool, we are gonna remove the stroke, and then we will be adding a fill, and we'll just make this one white. And then you just hold shift and draw a circle, then center it up, and then add a turbulent displace to it. You can just crank this up a whole bunch. You want something that looks pretty wonky. Something like this is pretty cool. You can even scale it and move it around a little bit until you get something that looks kind of funky. And you can always play around with the evolution options to get a little bit more movement in there. So let's alt click the evolution and then add a time times 10. And if we solo that up, I might make it a little bit easier to see. It'll just slowly animate around, just giving it just a little bit of movement. And then for the position, we will go to the very beginning, keyframe it, and just maybe move it up somewhere over there, go about halfway, maybe move it this way, maybe move it a little bit this way, maybe like that. And then we can take all of these and just add a little bit of easing by hitting F9. That'll ease your keyframes. And then we can always take these and just drag them out and create kind of a funky curve that just takes it all around the screen and just gives us something that looks pretty fun. And playing that back, we now have something that looks kind of like this. Just a nice, slow, blobby shape that kind of goes across. At each keyframe, it kind of stops. So if you click on the keyframes and go into your curves editor, you can drag these up from the ground, and that'll just make it so that it doesn't come to a complete stop. Maybe something like that. So now if we play that back, you can see how it just continuously moves. It doesn't come to a full stop, so it just makes it look a little bit nicer. And we will be using this shape as another blur map. So we are indeed gonna add a solid composite to this, and we will make the background black. And then in between these two effects, we will add a fastbox blur to soften out the edges of this a little bit. And you can just increase that, and you can also increase the iterations, and that'll just give it a higher quality blur. 6 usually works pretty good, and then you can always increase the blur radius. And then we will hide this. You can even just take the first layer we did and duplicate it. And then in the bottom one, let's change the layer map to the shape layer and keep the effects and masks. And of course, remove the invert, because this one, we actually want the whites of it to affect the blur. Now we just have a little bit of a blob moving around, giving us a little bit of that blurry kind of feel. You can see it right over his eye, which just looks pretty sick. I like the look of it. You might decrease the blur radius a little bit to something like 10. We can add a solid, and we will name this grain. And this is just a typical metal gray, same technique as always, add grain and change it to final output. Let's do a Kodak Vision 200T, add a tint and pre-comp it. Name this grain pre, and make sure that all attributes are on the new composition and set it to overlay, and that'll just give us a little bit of grain. We can create a new solid, and we'll name this particles. The color doesn't matter at all because we will be adding fractal noise, overrides it anyways. Increase the contrast a whole bunch, play around with the brightness. You just want a couple of specs. You can increase the complexity and transform, go and decrease the size of it until you get a couple of specs in there. Play around with it until you just have a select few, kind of like that. And you can go into the evolution options and alt click the random seed. And then if you do a posterize time 12 and then a random, let's do 1000. So it just picks a numerical value between 0 and 1000. And the posterize time is to slow it down. So now if we solo that up, you can see we just have a little bit of a particle animation in there. Maybe you can set it down to something like 6, which will just slow it down a little bit. Just kind of depends on the look you like to go in for. I like going for a little bit of a slower look. This looks pretty good to me. And we will unhide that. And then you just change the blender mode to something like add. And that'll just give you a little bit of those white particles. You can even decrease the opacity a little bit so it's not as glaring. And if you duplicate that, and let's unhide that, set it to normal, and you can add an invert to it so we get some black particles. And then this time unhide it and set it to multiply. That'll get rid of the white. So now we have black and white particles. In the highlights, you'll see the black more, and the dark areas, you'll see the white more, an extra layer of depth. And last but not least, we will be adding a texture to it, a little bit of an overlay texture. It's super small little texture, and we will just add that. Let's just start with it right above at the very top. And I just got this one from Texture Labs. And then you can cycle through the blend modes by holding shift and minus or plus. Soft light looks pretty cool. I'll just decrease the opacity of it just a little bit. And that is pretty much all there is to this little Dodford sequence. All the techniques used are to create an atmosphere of something more mysterious, something a little bit ethereal almost, because it helps you draw you into that universe. Not even so many 3D camera movements as you might think. It's a lot of very basic movements but put together in a really nice way. A lot of match cuts in there as well to keep you interested and engaged and help draw your attention to certain parts. You could probably do something similar in DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro. Couldn't tell you how, but you probably could if you're good enough. This is how you would do it in After Effects. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this. Hopefully you learned something new. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have for you this time. I'll see you again next week. Peace out.